U.S. jamming deflected a missile straight into a refinery. Venezuela is burning. A stray warhead just vaporized the Amuay energy grid.
The Caribbean Sea, January 5th, 2026, 9:30 a.m. local time. Most of the world imagines this water as a turquoise paradise, a place for cruise ships and rum cocktails. But if you look at the electromagnetic spectrum, if you strip away the blue water and look at the invisible web of radar waves and sonar pings, this is not a paradise. It is a cage. And on this specific morning, the cage was about to snap shut. The location is the Paraguaná Peninsula, the northernmost tip of Venezuela. The heat here is physical. 34 degrees Celsius, 90% humidity. The air hangs heavy over the water, distorting the horizon into a shimmering gray blur. But for the crew of the United States Coast Guard cutter Stone, the heat was the least of their problems. They were sailing directly into a geopolitical fracture that had been widening for 3 years. They call it the Maduro Line, a line drawn on a map in Caracas that does not exist in international law, but is enforced by steel and high explosives. To the south of the Stone lay the Venezuelan coast. To the east, the contested waters of the Essequibo region, territory that belongs to Guyana on paper, but which Venezuela had annexed in its constitution 2 years prior. This wasn't just about lines on a map. This was about what lay beneath the seabed. Billions of barrels of sweet light crude in the Stabroek Block, the lifeblood of the modern economy. The cutter Stone, a Legend-class vessel, is 4,500 tons of American diplomacy. White hull, racing stripe. It looks friendly. It is designed to chase drug smugglers, not fight wars. It has sensors, yes, the ANSLQ-32 electronic warfare suite. It has decoys, but it does not have heavy missiles. It is a police car in a neighborhood of tanks. And 5 minutes ago, the police car drove into the wrong neighborhood. At 9:35 a.m., at the nearby Josefa Camejo Air Base, the concrete tarmac began to vibrate. 2 Saturn AL-31 turbojet engines ignited, dumping raw kerosene into the combustion chambers. This is the sound of Russian aerospace engineering. The Sukhoi Su-30MK2. NATO call sign, Flanker G. This is not a subtle machine. It is a twin-engine heavy fighter designed for one purpose: to hunt ships. It is big, loud, and incredibly fast. As the 2 jets, call signs Libertador 11 and 12, lifted off the runway, they weren't just patrolling. They were carrying a message. Slung under their wings were KH-31A missiles. The West calls them Kryptons. We need to pause here. We need to understand the terrifying physics of the Krypton missile to understand why the crew of the cutter Stone was minutes away from incineration. The KH-31 is not a normal missile. It is a ramjet. Most missiles are rockets. They burn all their fuel in a few seconds and then coast. The Krypton is different. It launches with a solid fuel booster that kicks it to Mach 1.8. Then the magic happens. 4 air intakes on the side of the missile open up. The empty booster shell is ejected, and the ramjet engine ignites. It breathes air. It gulps oxygen from the atmosphere, mixes it with jet fuel, and compresses it through pure speed. It accelerates to Mach 2.5. That is approximately 850 meters per second. At that speed, the air doesn't flow around the missile. It is bludgeoned out of the way. The friction is so intense, the titanium skin of the missile heats up to 300 degrees Celsius. It becomes a streaking comet of heat and radar waves. For a ship like the Stone, the math is horrifying. Due to the curvature of the Earth, a ship's radar can only see a sea-skimming missile at about 15 to 20 miles. If a Krypton appears at 20 miles moving at Mach 2.5, you do not have minutes to react. You have less than 40 seconds, 60 seconds to detect, track, lock, and fire. If you blink, you die. But the Venezuelans had made a critical miscalculation. They assumed the Stone was alone. They assumed the United States Navy would not be watching. They were wrong. Loitering at 25,000 feet, invisible to the Venezuelan radar network, were 2 shapes that looked like holes in the sky. F-35C Lightning IIs from Strike Fighter Squadron 147, the Argonauts. These aircraft had launched from the USS George Washington, a nuclear supercarrier operating over the horizon. The F-35C is the carrier variant of the most advanced sensor platform in human history. It is often called a fighter jet, but that is a misnomer. It is a flying supercomputer wrapped in radar-absorbent materials. The Venezuelan Su-30s were shouting electronically. Their N001V radars were blasting out radio waves, searching for the Coast Guard ship. To the F-35s, this was like someone screaming in a library. The American pilots didn't need to use their own radar. Their passive sensors soaked up the Venezuelan signals, triangulated their position, and identified the exact waveform of the threat. This is the fundamental mismatch of modern warfare. The Su-30 is a gladiator. It is strong, agile, and armed with a spear. The F-35 is a sniper in a ghillie suit. The gladiator enters the arena beating his chest, looking for a fight. The sniper is already watching him through a scope, breathing slowly, deciding exactly how to end it. But the American commander did not order a shoot-down. Not yet. Shooting down a Venezuelan jet is an act of war. It creates martyrs. It starts World War III. Instead, the order was given for a soft kill. This brings us to the most complex and least understood aspect of 21st century combat, the electronic attack. We often think of war as kinetic, bullets hitting flesh, missiles hitting steel. But the real war happens in the ether, in the manipulation of electrons. The objective was to stop the KH-31 missile without ever touching it. The plan utilized cooperative blinking jamming to deceive the monopulse radar seeker. Here is the physics of how it works. The KH-31 missile uses a monopulse radar seeker. It sends out a pulse, the pulse bounces off the ship, and the missile steers toward the reflection. It's like a moth flying toward a porch light. Blinking jamming turns the F-35s into strobe lights. The two American jets, positioned miles apart, synchronized their electronic warfare suites. They began blasting high-power jamming pulses at the exact frequency of the missile's seeker. But they didn't do it constantly. They alternated. Jet A blasts a pulse. The missile's eye snaps toward Jet A. Milliseconds later, Jet A goes dark, and Jet B blasts a pulse. The missile's eye snaps toward Jet B, then back to A, then B, A, B, A, B. Imagine you are driving a car at 2,000 miles per hour. Suddenly, the road seems to jump 50 feet to the left. You jerk the steering wheel left. Then the road jumps 50 feet to the right. You jerk the wheel right. This is what happened to the guidance logic of the KH-31. The seeker could not resolve a single target. It saw the center of energy oscillating wildly across the sky. The missile's flight control computer screamed, slamming the hydraulic fins back and forth, trying to chase a phantom that was jumping miles in milliseconds. No mechanical system can sustain that. The lock broke. The missile, confused and blinded, stopped tracking the Coast Guard cutter. But here is the problem with physics. The laws of motion are unforgiving. The missile had lost its brain, but it still had its muscle. The ramjet engine was still burning. The solid rocket booster had already done its work. The weapon was still traveling at supersonic speeds, carrying a 200-pound high-explosive warhead. It didn't fall into the sea. It drifted. When a guided weapon loses its guidance, it becomes a ballistic object, a dumb rock moving at Mach 2.5. The jamming had pushed the missile's trajectory slightly inland. It skimmed over the white caps of the Caribbean, over the beach, and roared toward the industrial skyline of the coast. It was heading directly for Sector 23 of the Amuay Refinery. Specifically, towards a cluster of white spherical tanks. Sphere number 208. Inside Sphere 208 was 4,000 cubic meters of liquid butane. Liquefied petroleum gas. This is where the story shifts from tactical combat to industrial catastrophe. The Amuay Refinery is a sprawling complex of pipes and towers, processing hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil a day. But it is also a dying giant. Years of neglect, sanctions, and brain drain had left its safety systems rotting. The water deluge guns, designed to cool the tanks in a fire, were corroded. The gas detection sensors were offline. When you mix a supersonic Russian missile with a decaying energy infrastructure, it resulted in a boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion, or BLEVE. A boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion. The acronym sounds sterile, but the reality is one of the most violent phenomena in thermodynamics. We are about to witness the moment where a tactical mistake becomes a strategic disaster. The moment the fuse was lit on the Caribbean powder keg, Sector 23 of the Amuay Refinery, 9:45 a.m. and 12 seconds. The rogue KH-31 missile struck Sphere 208. It did not detonate on the outer skin. The semi-armor piercing warhead, designed to punch through the hull of a destroyer, treated the 3-inch steel shell of the gas tank like paper. Impact velocity was Mach 2.1. The missile punched a jagged entry hole near the equator of the sphere. Inside, the physics of containment failed instantly. This is the inciting incident, the mistake. Sphere 208 contained 4,000 cubic meters of liquid butane held at a pressure of 5 atmospheres. When the missile pierced the shell, the internal pressure didn't just leak out, it vanished. In the control room, 2 kilometers away, a board of green lights turned red. The operators didn't even have time to reach for the emergency shutdown switches. They were staring at a phenomenon that moves faster than human reflexes. Inside the tank, the liquid butane was suddenly exposed to atmospheric pressure. Thermodynamics dictates that at this pressure, butane cannot exist as a liquid above 0 degrees Celsius. The liquid inside was 34 degrees. It was superheated. In a microsecond, the entire mass of liquid butane underwent homogeneous nucleation. Every single molecule of liquid tried to turn into gas at the exact same moment. The liquid expanded 270 times its volume. The steel sphere didn't just crack, it unzipped. The metal tore along the weld lines, peeling open like an orange skin. Then, the ignition. The friction of the missile entry had generated sparks hot enough to melt titanium. The expanding cloud of butane vapor met this heat source. The result was not an explosion. It was a sun being born on the coast of Venezuela. The fireball expanded at the speed of sound, a sphere of plasma 600 meters wide. It engulfed the neighboring tanks, spheres 209 and 210, before they could even vent. The radiant heat output was 28 megawatts per second. To put that in perspective, if you were standing 1 kilometer away, the clothes would have melted onto your skin. The shockwave hit the ground with the force of a small tactical nuclear weapon. It flattened the administration buildings. It shattered windows in the city of Punto Fijo, 10 miles away. But the real devastation was the domino effect. The heat from the primary fireball softened the steel of the adjacent tanks. The metal reached 400 degrees Celsius, losing half its structural strength. The internal pressure rose. The safety valves screamed, venting gas into the inferno, feeding the fire. One by one, the spheres failed. A chain reaction of thermal violence. The Paraguaná Refinery complex, the largest refining center in the Western Hemisphere, was being dismantled by the laws of physics. By 9:50 a.m., the smoke column had punched through the troposphere, visible from satellites in low Earth orbit. The Amuay Refinery was gone. In Washington, the National Security Council was paralyzed. The operation was supposed to be a clean electronic intercept. Instead, they had just inadvertently decapitated the energy infrastructure of a sovereign nation. But the silence didn't last long. At 10:15 a.m., a priority cable arrived at the State Department. It wasn't from Caracas, it was from Moscow. The Russian Federation was not viewing this as an accident. They were viewing it as a prelude to invasion. The message came from the Admiral Gorshkov, a stealth frigate patrolling just outside the U.S. exclusion zone. The Gorshkov is the most dangerous surface combatant in the Russian Navy for one reason: the Zircon missile, Mach 9. Hypersonic, a weapon that flies so fast, the plasma sheath around it absorbs radar waves, making it nearly invisible until it impacts. The Russian captain placed his ship on heightened combat alert. He unlocked the launch codes for the Zircon tubes. The threat was explicit. Any further aggression against our allies will be met with asymmetric kinetic response. This was the brink. A Russian warship, armed with unstoppable hypersonic missiles, staring down a U.S. carrier strike group, while a refinery burned in the background. And then, the second shoe dropped. While the eyes of the world were fixed on the burning Caribbean coast, Something was happening 6,000 miles away. In the Taiwan Strait, at exactly 10:30 a.m., the People's Liberation Army initiated Justice Mission 2025. This was not a drill. It was a synchronized pressure test. Radar screens in Taipei lit up like Christmas trees. 90 Chinese aircraft crossed the median line in a single hour. TB-001 twin-tailed Scorpion drones encircled the island, establishing a persistent surveillance ring. It was a masterclass in strategic coordination. Beijing knew the U.S. Navy was fixated on Venezuela. They knew the carrier George Washington was tied down. They seized the moment to shatter the status quo in the Pacific. The U.S. was now facing the nightmare scenario, a two-theater crisis against two nuclear-armed adversaries, triggered by a single stray missile in South America. Let's look at the scorecard. The aftermath of January 5th. The Paraguaná disaster removed 71% of Venezuela's refining capacity. The country, which sits on the world's largest oil reserves, now has to import gasoline to fuel its ambulances. The Maduro line is gone, not because the Navy was defeated, but because the Navy has no fuel to sail. The environmental cost is incalculable. The smoke plume deposited toxic particulates across the Caribbean basin. The beaches of Aruba and Curacao are coated in soot. But the strategic cost is the most chilling. The Southern Spear incident proved that the era of limited warfare is over. You cannot just send a message with a missile anymore. The systems are too fast, the lethality is too high, and the margins for error are too small. A simple electronic jamming signal, a collection of invisible radio waves, interacted with a 20-year-old missile seeker and a rotting refinery to change the map of the world. The U.S. Navy won the tactical engagement. The Su-30s were neutralized. The Coast Guard ship is safe. But the price was a diplomatic catastrophe that brought the superpowers to the edge of the nuclear precipice. So here is the question for you. If you were the commander of the USS George Washington, staring at those incoming Venezuelan jets, knowing they had a lock on a U.S. ship, would you have given the order to jam? Knowing what you know now, knowing that the jamming would send a missile into a refinery and ignite a global crisis, would you still pull the trigger? Or would you have let the Coast Guard ship take the hit? War is not about right and wrong choices. It is about consequences. And on January 5th, 2026, the consequences burned bright enough to be seen from space. Fair winds and following seas. See you in the next one. Fair winds and following seas. But remember this, in a world defined by algorithms and Mach speed, silence on the radar does not mean peace. It is simply the reload time between wars.